Story 1. The Man in the Mist. In 1998, a group of scouts ventured on a camping trip in a dense forest in the interior of Oregon. Led by Paul Davidson and his assistant Mark, they set up their tents in a relatively open clearing surrounded by tall, thick trees. The sun barely managed to penetrate the dense canopy, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. During the day, the forest seemed like a peaceful refuge, but at night, its atmosphere changed completely. The wind whistled through, the branches and the sounds of animals echoed in the darkness. On the second night, a thick mist began to spread, enveloping the campsite in an almost tangible curtain. Paul woke up around 2 a.m. with an urgent need to go to the bathroom. He stepped out of the tent, rubbing his eyes and taking a deep breath of the cold night air. That was when he saw him. Among the trees a few meters away, a man stood completely still. His body was thin and his skin pale, almost bluish. The clothes he wore were old-fashioned, like something out of a photograph from the 1920s. He looked soaked, as if he had just emerged from a lake. His eyes were sunken and empty, and he trembled violently. Paul felt a chill run down his spine. "Hey," he called hesitantly. "Are you okay?" The man did not respond. He only took a step forward, and in the next instant disappeared into the mist as if he had never been there. Paul blinked a few times, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of his drowsy mind. He rubbed his eyes and looked around, but there was nothing there. Feeling his heart still racing, he returned to his tent and buried himself in his sleeping bag, trying to ignore the growing unease in his chest. The next morning, as the group prepared for breakfast, one of the boys called everyone's attention. "Look at this." The ground around the campsite was covered in wet footprints, barefoot prints, forming a strange pattern, circling the tents before disappearing into the woods. But what was most disturbing was the fact that there was no lake or river nearby. "This is weird," Mark said, frowning. Paul felt a cold knot in his stomach. He remembered the man from the previous night and his soaked clothes. But before he could share his experience, something even more unsettling happened. Inside his tent, on top of his sleeping bag, there was an old newspaper. The paper was yellowed, the edges worn, as if it had been stored for decades. Paul picked up the newspaper with trembling hands and read the headline, "Tragedy at the Camp. Young man disappears, body never found." His heart seemed to stop when he read the name of the victim, Paul Davidson, the same name as his. The paper slipped from his hands. A chill ran down his spine. He looked around, expecting to see an expression of surprise or terror on his friends' faces, but they were busy with the footprints. Mark approached him. "What's wrong, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." Paul didn't respond. He picked up the newspaper again, expecting to see a different name, a different date. But it was there, etched as a macabre warning. October 14, 1923. "This has to be a prank," he muttered, trying to stay calm. "It has to be." But something inside him knew it wasn't. And the mist around the campsite seemed thicker than before, as if it were waiting for something, as if it wanted to swallow yet another story lost to time. That night, Paul stayed awake for hours, watching the edge of the camp. But he was not alone. Every time he blinked, he felt a presence in the mist, watching, waiting. Story 2. The Whisper in the Wind. Diego and Mariana had always been fascinated by adventure. Both loved exploring remote places, far from the noise of the city and the predictability of routine. When they discovered an abandoned campsite high in the mountains, shrouded in stories of disappearances and a mysterious fire in the 80s, they did not hesitate to plan a trip there. The idea of spending the night in a place full of legends excited them. The trail to the site was difficult, steep climbs, twisted trees, and the absolute silence of the surrounding forest made the atmosphere heavy, as if they were being watched. They arrived at the location late in the afternoon, with the sun tinting the sky red. The ruins of the campsite were covered in moss and vines. The wooden cabins collapsed, and what remained of the old campfire seemed to have been disturbed recently. Even so, they set up their tent in a clearing near an old stone structure that appeared to have been a communal kitchen. The wind blew strong, carrying the distant smell of something burnt. But Diego and Mariana paid little attention. They lit a fire and spent hours talking and laughing, ignoring the stories surrounding that place. When night fell completely, they went to sleep, wrapped in the deep silence of the forest. It was in the middle of the night that Mariana woke up. Something was bothering her. The wind howled around the tent, but as she paid closer attention, she realized it was not just the wind. It was a whisper. Someone was murmuring her name. She froze, her wide eyes fixed on the darkness around her. With her heart racing, she nudged Diego, who grumbled before opening his eyes. When he fell silent, he heard it too. The whisper came from outside. They exchanged hesitant glances. Mariana grabbed Diego's hand and cautiously unzipped the tent. The cold night air wrapped around them. On the other side of the fire, a female figure stood motionless. It was a woman. Her long hair was tangled, her face partially obscured by the darkness. Her dress had once been white, but was now charred and stained. Her skin bore burn marks in some places, revealing exposed flesh and blisters. Her deep, hollow eyes fixed on Mariana. "Please," the woman murmured, her voice blending with the wind. The tone was one of pleading, of pain. Mariana instinctively stepped forward, drawn by the silent lament. But Diego gripped her arm tightly. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice laden with fear. In the blink of an eye, the woman vanished. Only the wind remained, whistling through the trees. The next morning, the couple decided to investigate the campsite. They searched the ruins, the remnants of cabins, and the charred stones that had once been fireplaces. Then, in a small hidden space among gnarled trees, they found something unusual, an improvised gravestone. It was a wooden plank, worn by time, with a name carved into it. Mariana S. Alves. 1983. Mariana felt a deep chill run down her spine. The name, it was hers, the same first name, the same initial of the surname. The couple spoke no further words. They quickly gathered their things and left the campsite without looking back. Neither of them spoke about what had happened. Neither of them tried to find answers. But weeks later, when they had already returned to their city routine, Mariana noticed something strange. Whenever the wind blew, she heard the whisper again. Sometimes faint, almost imperceptible. Other times, clear, calling her name. Whispering, and on the quietest nights she began to feel a presence at the foot of her bed. Something was watching, something was waiting. Story 3. The Visitor of Cabin. 12. This story happened in 2012 at a summer camp in rural Minnesota. The place, known as Camp Hollow Lake, was a refuge for children and teenagers, surrounded by a dense forest and a deep lake. During the day, the sound of laughter and games echoed among the trees. But at night, an unsettling silence spread across the place. The older ones told scary stories to the younger ones, and one always stood out: the legend of Nathan, the boy, who disappeared from Cabin 12. During the last week of camp, one of the counselors named Ethan was assigned to supervise the boys in Cabin 12. There was an unspoken discomfort among the other counselors when he was given that cabin. Some avoided talking about it, while others whispered that years ago, a boy named Nathan had mysteriously disappeared during the night and was never found. Some said he had run away, others swore that something had taken him. Ethan, a skeptical and practical young man, didn't put much stock in these stories. He considered it all a childish attempt to scare the new counselors. However, something unsettled him. Since settling into cabin 12, he felt an abnormal chill, even on the warm summer nights. The creaking of the beds, the wind against the windows, and the strange sensation of being watched robbed him of sleep. On the fourth night, something happened. Around 2 a.m, Ethan woke up with an inexplicable chill running through his body. He sat up in bed and looked around. All the children seemed to be asleep, however, something was wrong. He held his breath, and then he noticed one of the bunks was empty. His heart pounded. He got up and checked the empty bed. The sheet was tossed aside, and a cold breeze entered through the slightly open window. "Jason?" he called in a low tone, trying not to wake the other boys. No response. Fear was growing in his chest, but he forced himself to act. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside the cabin. The camp was shrouded in an eerie silence. Ethan hurried toward the lake, feeling a tight knot in his stomach. As soon as he reached the shore, the flashlight's beam revealed barefoot footprints in the mud, leading toward the water. "Jason," he called again, this time a little louder. Nothing. He scanned the dark lake surface with the flashlight, and then the light flickered over a figure. Jason was there, standing in the water, facing away from him. His feet were sinking into the mud and his body was completely still. Ethan's heart raced. "What are you doing? Come back here." His voice echoed through the night, but Jason didn't respond. He just slowly turned his head, revealing something that made the counselor stumble back in pure horror. Jason's eyes were gone. In their place, there were only dark, empty sockets. Ethan stumbled backward and ran back to the cabin, consumed by a primal fear. He didn't stop until he woke the other counselors, babbling desperately about what he had seen. When they all rushed to the lake, Jason was no longer there. Back in cabin 12, they found the boy sleeping soundly in his bed, his face serene, as if he had never left. The next morning, when they asked if he remembered anything, Jason just rubbed his eyes and said he wanted to play. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "Who, Jason? Who wanted to play?" The boy pointed to the window and murmured, "The boy who lives in the lake." After that, cabin 12 was permanently closed. But some of the older counselors swear that on certain summer nights you can still hear wet footprints echoing through the camp, accompanied by whispers coming from the lake. The legend of Nathan continued to haunt Camp Hollow Lake, and those who dare to go too close to the water at midnight might see the silhouette of a boy with no eyes, patiently waiting for someone else to play.